Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution interview series with noted authors and historians to discuss what really happened during our war for independence. My name is Randy Flood, and today I'll be talking with historian Mark Edward Lender about his best selling book, Fatal Sunday: George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle. Now, Mark is emeritus professor of history at Kean University, New Jersey, and has written widely on early American military and social history. He's the author of The War for American Independence and co author of the award winning Citizen Soldier, the Revolutionary War Journals of Joseph Bloomfield, and Fatal Sunday: George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle, the latter of which was nominated for the 2017 George Washington Book Prize. And we'll be talking about Fatal Sunday today with Mark. So, Mark, welcome to the Real American Revolution.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, Mark, let's begin. We know that the winter of 1777 1778, General Washington and his Continental Army were encamped at Valley Forge. The British were occupying Philadelphia. That spring, British commander Henry Clinton, who had relieved General William Howe as the commander of all British forces in North America, decided to return with his army to New York City. Now, the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey, fought on June 28th, 1778, occurred when General Washington attacked the rear guard of that British army as they were departing across New Jersey from Philadelphia to New York City. So, the first question here is: a number of books have been written about this battle. Why do another book about Monmouth? What makes Monmouth so important?
Well, there are a couple of reasons, and one is very personal. I grew up in New Jersey, not far from the Monmouth battlefield. And having been familiar with it, literally walking around for any number of years, I mean, since I was in high school, we actually cut class one day to drive down there. I got to know the lay of the land fairly well. A number of things occurred to me even at that time. If you walk the battlefield at Monmouth and get a sense of what the terrain looks like, of course, it's changed remarkably over the years, but a surprising amount is left. It's one of the best preserved battlefields we have got from the Revolutionary period. Some things did not add up, and I'm talking particularly about the charges leveled eventually against Major General Charles Lee. Uh, to me, it seemed that given the open nature of the terrain, given the numbers involved, Lee or anybody in Lee's circumstances simply wouldn't have stood a chance. So that intrigued me. Um, then there was the issue, and what really got me going toward a book was the nature of Washington's command. I had given a number of talks on Washington as commander in chief, and when he really began to come into his own, and it occurred to me that given Washington's political malaise in late 1777 and early 1770, any battle he fought after the Valley Forge experience was going to be important. His reputation had come under fire. How seriously under fire we can talk about. Nevertheless, he had come in for quite a bit of criticism. And no matter where a battle would have been fought post Valley Forge, it was going to be incredibly important for Washington's reputation. And so there had to be significant political implications to any battle fought under those circumstances. That had riveted me. That's really was the genesis of the book, it's the politics
Mm-hmm.
of battle, which is the subtitle of the book. I was lucky to connect with an archaeologist. That's my co-author, Gary
Mm-hmm.
Willis, who for many years worked on the battle, probably knows more about the terrain down there and the archaeology of it than anyone alive. And as time went on and I began to rely on him, particularly as things began to literally come out of the ground, it seemed like a natural theme that
Mm-hmm.
we could be looking at this together and see things perhaps that others had not seen. And, that's the way it turned out. That's the way it.
Absolutely. Oh, fascinating. Well, many historians consider Monmouth one of the most complicated battles of the American Revolution, of the entire Revolutionary War, perhaps the most complicated. What makes it so complicated, and why is Monmouth different than any other military engagement?
Well, there's a number of things can go on with that. One of the problems with Monmouth is there were too many witnesses. It was fought in a relatively populated area. It was fought in relatively open terrain for much of the day. And so you had any number of people looking at that battle from any number of different perspectives. And so, if even everybody reporting accurately what they saw, the views were going to be conflicting. Of course, when people report what they see, frequently they don't know what they're seeing. They don't know the circumstances between a unit moving. Uh, they hear a lot of gunfire and naturally assume that there's a huge battle going on when maybe there's not. And we had this at Monmouth, so it was very confusing. Then
Hmm.
there was the issue of the units that were engaged. Battle was not fought as a general engagement. Battle was fought piecemeal, or skirmishing in the morning, tough fighting in the morning, um, limited counterattacks by Washington against Clinton in the afternoon, uh, a huge cannonade for a good part of the afternoon. So you had all these different segments of the fighting going on. And it was tough for a lot of people to put the pieces together. And it was tough for a lot of historians to put pieces when they didn't do original research. We look at a lot of the histories of Monmouth, see the same sources quoted over and over and over again. I've
Hmm.
forgotten who said it, a historian from several generations ago, but put it well and said, you've got to go to the source. And that's what
Hmm.
Gary Stone and I tried.
Hmm.
Clean slate, go back to basic primary sources, take a look at the new archaeology that's coming out, take advantage of new sources that have become available. When Gary and I started to write, the letters of delegates of the Continental Congress were available to us online, also in print. The Washington Papers Project had gone online, and luckily the editing process had gone all the way through the Monmouth period. We had things available to us that other historians simply did not have.
Hmm.
So we were lucky in that.
That's great. That's a nice advantage to have. Well, Mark, as you know, there's a lot of myths about the American Revolution in general and the war in particular. As historians, we always try to uncover the truth of what really happened. When you were doing your research, did you uncover any new discoveries that might debunk any of the myths about Monmouth and any surprising results in your research?
Well, I think so. We can look both tactically and politically here. Among other things we found, and here's where the archaeology meshes beautifully. We could actually trace some of Washington's counterattacks in the afternoon. Now, Washington had been thrown back on the defensive. Lee had retreated in the morning, and we can talk about Lee's retreat. But Lee had retreated in the morning. Washington had taken position on high ground, the very high ground toward which Lee was retreating. Um, and in the afternoon, he sent two counterattacks, one on the American left against the British right, and it was under Colonel Joseph Silly and a battalion of picked men. Picked men being Washington asked each regiment to send your best 20 guys and a couple of your really good officers and put them in temporary battalions to go after, of all things, the 42nd Foot, the Black Watch, one of the best the British had. And then subsequently, a bit after that, he sent Anthony Wayne out of the American Center to hit at Clinton on the high ground immediately in front of him. Now, where exactly that happened has always been something of a controversy. We were able to look at the some of the newly available uh, evidence on the British side, journals, letters by officers who simply hadn't been available to other historians. Now they were published, and we also got some archival material to get a British perspective on what happened. And then the archaeology, which was astonishing. Want to know where the 42nd Foot was as the Americans attacked? You could find a line of American impact ammunition. We know exactly where the 42nd. Want to know where the Americans stood when they opened fire? There was the evidence of the British impact ammunition. And it was just too conclusive to say otherwise. More dramatic, perhaps, before Washington was able to consolidate his position on the high ground after Lee's retreat, Clinton made one final desperate attempt to reach Washington's main position, and he sent uh, a very gallant charge by the Second Grenadiers,
Hmm.
and they walked into a wall of grape and canister. And you see where that American impact, the artillery impact, hit. It was testimony to the skill of the American gunners. They had retrained at Valley Forge. We knew they were good. This is some of the first hard evidence how good they were against an elite British unit. It was over in a minute or two. These poor fellows didn't stand a chance.
Hmm.
And you can just look at where all that ammunition was, and you know exactly where the Grenadiers came to a dead stop and had to pull back.
Hmm.
And then and it's almost blood curdling to look at the accounts of the following day as American medical person and to move toward the front and found grenadiers mired in the creek, um, dead on the ground coming up the slope toward Washington. They didn't get far. Did their best to help any wounded they found, British, American, mostly British wounded because they were attacking. It was absolutely grisly stuff we were able to uncover.
Hmm.
A more dramatic find, I think, as we concluded that, and this is perhaps more controversial than anything else, that Charles Lee fought a remarkably good battle. He had uh, advanced. It was almost a picture perfect movement to contact in the morning. He made the mistake. He did not have accurate intelligence of the British strength. He thought he was going to encircle and trap a British rear guard. A neat little trick, minor battle without imperiling the rest of his vanguard. Turned out that that rear guard was really Charles Lord Cornwallis was about 6,000 guys coming right down his throat. He didn't stand it. Pulled back in good order. Uh, Frequently, historians point to his retreat as sort of the proof of the pudding of Steuben's training at Valley Forge, that they were able to pull back in the face of overwhelming numbers, but do it in an orderly fashion. More than once, Lee looked for a position to make a stand. And he was not, this was not a rout, but it was a progressive retreat. And finally, he had the good fortune to run into a local militiaman who lived on the battlefield, or what became the battlefield. And he volunteered, "You looking for a place to go?" And Lee said, "You bet," or where's the effect of "you bet." And it was ultimately this individual who pointed out uh, the heights behind a large creek, morass, as it's called, on which Washington actually took position. That's where Lee was going. And I don't think that the record can be interpreted any other way than that Lee fought a very good fight that day.
Hmm.
Anybody wants proof? Take a look at the court-martial transcript. It's all in there.
Hmm.
So I think that as Gary and I have met with different groups over time, our finding on Charles Lee seems to be accepted now, but with an awful lot of people saying, well, how about that?
Sure. Well, as a quick follow up to that, did Washington, the major confrontation that is depicted by historians between Lee and Washington, did Washington actually relieve Lee of his command or?
No, he did not. There was this confrontation on the battlefield. There is no question about that. And I would have paid a ticket to be there to overhear it. Washington was disturbed. I mean, he had thought from preliminary intelligence that Lee, who had gone forward with a vanguard of something under 4,000 men, while Washington was going to bring up the main army. Washington had thought from preliminary intelligence reports that Lee was making progress and was moving to engage. What Washington did not know was that Lee had begun to pull back in the face of a major British counterattack. Not only Cornwallis was coming, by the way, but Clinton also turned around. So probably by the time Washington started to come up, Lee was facing more in the order of eight. Uh, the elite of the British Army, we're talking about Guards regiments, Grenadiers. This was the best the British Army could throw at the Continental Army. So Lee was surprised uh, at Washington's reaction. Lee, when he met Washington coming up, honestly thought he was going to be congratulated by getting the vanguard out of trouble. That was the biggest career mistake he probably ever made. Uh, Washington was alarmed. There are all sorts of stories about what Washington said. One of the best, I guess, is by Brigadier General Charles Scott, who claimed that on that day Washington swore like an angel. He swore till the leaves shook on the trees. Never in his entire life did he hear such beautiful swearing. If this is true, it's not true. But if it's true, it means that Brigadier General Charles Scott had the best hearing in American military history. Because when Washington and Lee met, he was probably about a mile away. It's many,
Oh.
many years after it. Lafayette wrote his memoirs as an old man, and it's very fancy, highly
Uh-huh.
inaccurate. Claims that Washington wrote up to Lee and called him, quote, a damned. I had to look up poltroon. It's not a compliment, but
Yeah.
there is there is there's no evidence that Washington. Or in fact, a pretty good scholar looked specifically at that question. Talk about a narrow niche in history, but did Washington swear at Monmouth? And there's absolutely no evidence that he did.
Hmm.
And I point people toward the transcript of the court martial, which has a pretty good account of who said what and when they said it.
Hmm.
And it did not relieve Lee. Washington rode forward, Lee trailing, bewildered, perhaps thinking he'd been relieved. But within a minute or two, I mean, Washington rode forward and said, by God, the whole British Army is coming. What do we do? Washington quickly told Anthony Wayne to take some men, go into a patch of terrain called the Point of Woods, a woodsy point that came jutted out over the main road
Hmm.
on which the British were coming toward the American. And then he told Lee, look, we've got to fight a holding. Either you stay here and fight the holding action, and I'll go back and organize the main line, or you go back and organize the main line. I'll stay here and fight the holding action. Now, Lee's pride had been stung, and he wasn't going to ride. He said, I'll stay forward. And he did with Henry Knox, and fought some of the toughest fighting of the day and some of the toughest fighting of the war. You can go and walk the ground today. That's part of what I did is, and relatively recently. I think the last time I was there was probably last year, and look at a line called the hedgerow. Hedgerow was sort of a split rail fence with bushes and shrubs that had grown up through it over the years. Inadvertently, the original got bulldozed a good number of years back, but Boy Scout project has
Yeah.
reconstituted the hedgerow. You can still see a good portion of it. But you had guys on different sides jabbing at each other with bayonets through the hedgerow on various sides. The Americans got off maybe 3, 4 volleys. So this was over. It was over in 7 minutes.
Hmm.
Lee finally pulled back when the American horse, it was a militia, uh, riders began to pull back under pressure from the British dragoons, and the dragoons began to flank Lee's right. He had no way to stop them, and the troops that chased Wayne out of the Point of Woods began to flank Lee on the left. They pulled back in good order. Charles Lee was probably the last man over the bridge of the West Morass to reach safety.
Interesting.
It was he fought a very, very good fight. There's no question about that. This is this can bear some further research, I think, and I think I'm going to look into it again myself to just sort of flesh out some details that have come to light since.
Hmm.
Uh, Complicated man, Charles Lee, but
Yeah.
lots of reasons to dislike the man. But his performance at Monmouth was not one of them.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Well, those are the types of golden nuggets that it's important to for the public to understand. Now, one myth that continues to be perpetuated is this legend of Molly Pitcher. You know, the wife of a soldier who, when the soldier was killed or perhaps passed out during the heat exhaustion that was occurred that day, while he was manning a cannon, that she basically took over the artillery duties of her husband. What's the true story about Molly Pitcher?
I have a quick and definitive answer for you. I don't know, and nobody does. The issue with Molly Pitcher is it's Molly. Nobody called her Molly Pitcher at the time, and if there was a Molly Pitcher, it should be plural, Molly Pitchers, S on the end, because we do know that there was more than one woman on the battlefield. And Molly Pitcher of lore was probably Mary Hayes, who later became Mary Hayes McCauley. She remarried after the war. Her husband was an artillerist, and we do find his name on the artillery roll. He was there. There's no question about that.
Mhm.
Hayes, and she was probably there as well, but she was not manning a gun. Very likely bringing water to the gun crews. It was brutally hot. In the mid 90s. One temperature reading we've got was from Philadelphia, 102.
Mhm.
And so, but there had been a succession of really hot days. So more people were dropping from the heat and heat stroke from combat. And we think probably her husband went down from heat stroke. He's not on the list of killed in action, so or even
Okay.
dead. So he probably
Mhm.
survived. If she was there, and she probably was, she was bringing water. We do know there was one spring, not the well that was built as Molly Pitcher's well, probably dug around 1820 something. The the early tourist trade, but there was a spring that you can still go and see.
Uh-huh.
And that must have been it. And she was probably bringing buckets of water, not just for the gun crews, but for the guns. They
Yeah.
had to be swabbed between
Hmm.
rounds,
Sure.
and it was vital. If you didn't have water to swab the guns, you didn't have your artillery. That was it.
Yeah.
We also know that from various other archival sources that Mary Hayes was not the only woman there. So
Hmm.
had others, and we do know that when fire lifted and then people began to get out and try to help the wounded, you did have other women out there trying to help out. There's a story of a woman who fought with Nathaniel Greene's group over on the extreme American right.
Hmm.
Supposedly, they made a collection afterwards presented to George Washington. There's even a portrait of this, and it's all myth.
Yeah.
Um, there may have been a woman with Nathaniel Greene's area, but uh, folklore that came in, and Mom was big on folklore. I mean,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
battle, like I said, was fought in a populated area. People saw it, and the legends of the fighting and who was there spun out
Hmm.
from forward.
Interesting.
It spawned the Monmouth battle really spawned some of the first American reenactments, and very early on,
Hmm.
they began to have people out there walking
Hmm.
the field of military tourism
Hmm.
in the early 1800s.
Interesting. Well, we seldom hear about African Americans in the Revolutionary War who actually fought for both sides. Tell us about the infamous Colonel Ty and the role he played at Monmouth.
He played no role, and this is something that if uh, you start looking at the different publications that put him at Monmouth, and you try to track back on where they got their sources, and they sort of cite each other, and nobody goes back to the primary source. Ty was a real figure. And he was not a colonel; it was an honorific, and the British were glad to give him the honorific because he was a very effective partisan leader. He was a slave from Monmouth County who freed himself by the revolution broke out, like thousands of other slaves went to British lines. He ended up on Sandy Hook, where he began to take part in raids back into Monmouth County. He knew the terrain. He was very valuable as a guide and a scout. As more escaped slaves reached Sandy Hook, the British allowed them to organize what's called a Black Brigade. Probably didn't operate in groups much more than 40, 50, maybe 60 at different times, sometimes interracial, in close cooperation with white loyalists. And I think that's kind of an interesting subject that we need to look at in greater depth because
Hmm.
the dislocation, the psychological dislocation of loyalists, perfectly happy, and all of a sudden their world collapses. And it was enough to drive them to make them ally
Hmm.
with freed slaves and given the race prejudices of the day um, to in effect make common cause with people they would not have associated with.
Hmm.
But Ty was an effective raider, and you can find uh, stories spun about where he went to Virginia. He got that. Well, could he? How could he get? This is mostly undocumented. What is documented are his activities in Monmouth County, and you can look in pensions by New Jersey militiamen, and they will tell you, I fought Ty. And I was out on patrol, and we ran into Ty. You had those on the American side who gave him credit for being better as a partisan leader than an awful lot of white leaders.
Hmm.
He doesn't need American historians to look back to find a black. He stood on his own, and the greatest compliments were paid to Colonel Ty were by the American militia that he faced. They feared him, said as much.
Hmm.
Got credit for as the guerrilla leader that he was. So, but was he at the Battle of Monmouth? We can't find anything in the documentary record that,
Hmm.
and it's unlikely that he would have been there and not have been noticed. But people knew who Ty was. If Ty was at Monmouth, somebody would have said something. Nobody on the American side there, nobody on the British side that we.
Hmm.
And this was not his kind of a fight anyway.
Hmm.
He was a partisan leader, and a stand-up battle is not the kind of thing that partisans.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, in your book subtitle, you reference the politics of battle. What exactly do you mean, the politics of battle?
Well, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, any battle fought under Washington's leadership after Valley Forge would have been important. Turned out it was the Battle of Monmouth. Now, there's an entire chapter on the political background of that campaign. And for Washington, it was pretty dicey. In late 1777, his military reputation was taking a real hit. He'd lost at Brandywine. Uh, Major portion of his command under Anthony Wayne was virtually destroyed in a bayonet attack at Paoli. His counterattack at Germantown failed. He lost the de facto American capital at Philadelphia, which was a real blow to him. While at the same time, to the north, Saratoga, Horatio Gates was forcing the surrender of an entire British army under Lieutenant General John Burke. Comparisons between Washington's performance and Gates's performance were not flattering to the commander in chief. And there was a lack in Congress and plenty of officers, plenty of people within the officer corps itself who concluded that as much as they may have thought well of Washington as an individual, he was not necessarily the man who was going to win the war. Generals are hired to win wars. Now, there's always been some controversy over how serious the threat to Washington's command really was. We did not settle that in Fatal Sunday. The point we made was that Washington was under fire. was under stress and that it was serious fire. Now, if he had come out of Valley Forge and lost another battle, I can't imagine that the hue and cry against him wouldn't have overwhelmed. He needed a win to cement his position in command of the army. He dealt politically with his critics. He dealt successfully with that. I explained that in another context, and in fact, in a subsequent book to Fatalist. But the key thing here is that at Monmouth, his own leadership seemed to demonstrate to the American public that he was the man in command. He was the right man in the right,
Hmm.
which is interesting because tactical, Monmouth was a draw. Henry Clinton, the British commander in chief, had orders to get his army back to New York because it was to be major parts of it to be redeployed to other theaters when the South, some to other parts of the British Empire, notably in the Caribbean. French were in the war. Everybody knew the Spanish were seriously considering coming in. They did come in 1789. So uh, the northern colonies were not going to be the British focus anymore. Clinton succeeded in getting his army back. Now he marched very slowly across New Jersey from Philadelphia toward New York. And this is another thing we found. It wasn't just the heat and the bad roads that slowed him down. Uh, Washington's intelligence came correctly to the conclusion Henry Clinton was going slowly because he was looking, was just hoping Washington would catch up with, or a major portion of the Continental Army would catch up with him. But Clinton, after deciding that Washington wasn't going to give him a showdown battle after that, the engagement on the 28th of June, got his army back, uh, columns strung out almost 10 miles at different times. I mean, about 20,000 soldiers and civilians, um, over 1,000 wagons. He got back to Sandy Hook, didn't lose a single wagon. I mean,
Hmm.
as a feat, it was quite extraordinary. So, how did Washington claim a victory? Well, his personal leadership in the afternoon was exemplary. There's no question about that. After Lee finally pulled back, Washington had the main army on Pine Hill, uh, overlooking the British position across this creek, the Western Morass. And he rode the lines. He was steady. He rallied his men. I mean, he was seen to be in command, and a lot of people in battle, looking back, and in battle, they said that was his best day, just as a personal command. Really looked like commander in day. But he had help in shoring up his reputation. And one guy who he didn't like and turned out to be a perfect scapegoat, and that was Charles Lee.
Hmm.
He had pulled back that morning. People had seen the confrontation. Many officers around Washington did not like Lee anyway, and there was all sorts of personal reasons for that. And as we began to look at accounts by witnesses in the officer corps, there were rumors about Lee's conduct every evening of the battle, even before uh, anybody knew that Henry Clinton had begun to retreat. Spin doctors, we would call them spin doctors today. If you look at Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence in particular, Hamilton and Lawrence were very young, years old, and colonels on Washington's staff, part of the Washington military family. Was very fond of them both. Hamilton is familiar to people. John Lawrence less familiar, but he was the son of Henry Lawrence, who at the time was the president of the Continental Congress. Very quickly after the battle, John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton launched a letter writing campaign, getting to anybody they could, praising Washington and blaming the fact that Clinton had got away. It was it fair? No, it wasn't fair, but it was brilliantly orchestrated. And it was politics, army politics at its highest level. This was we didn't see anything like it in the American army until the Newburgh conspiracy in 1783, when politics really got into high gear. But you had officers who were frankly hoping to get Lee out of the army, and there were points of conflict between Washington and Lee that went beyond whatever happened at Monmouth. But as the rumor mill began to reach Lee's ears, he did something which maybe is the second biggest mistake in his career after his confrontation with Washington. In the 18th century, if your reputation was impugned, you were a senior officer, you demanded a court martial to clear your name and you would be acquitted with honor. Lee demanded a court martial to clear his name. Uh, he did this after an exchange of letters with Washington in which he was clearly insolent. There's no question about that. I don't know if Washington ever got down on his knees and prayed at Valley Forge. But when Lee demanded a court martial to clear his name, I can just imagine Washington saying, "Thank you, now we've got him." And he gave him his court martial. What Lee did not understand was that if you demand a court martial to clear your name, you don't do it in an argument with the commander in chief. Washington appointed the court martial. Lee conducted a brilliant defense. He was charged with uh, conducting a disorderly and shameful retreat, retreating without orders, against positive orders to attack, and for writing insolent letters to the chief. The first two charges were ridiculous. His orders were discretionary. Washington made it clear he didn't want Lee to risk a major portion. Um, and even the court martial board softened that charge, saying in sometimes disorderly retreat, but he clearly had been insolent to the commander in chief. And if he'd been cleared by that court martial, it would have been seen as a slap against Washington, and that wasn't. But even when the court martial was sent to Congress to be certified, this was the court martial included took place in July. Congress batted it back and forth, didn't reach a decision until December of 1778, and even then, about a third of Congress voted in favor of Lee. In the way they cast their vote. Whoa! I just had a big lightning strike here.
Mm.
Voted to sustain the position of Charles Lee. So there was a feeling, even at the time, that if Lee had been truly guilty, he was suspended from, it wasn't even thrown out of the army. He was suspended in his command for a year. And at the time, people said, well, if this guy's really guilty, that's a slap on the wrist. That's absurd. And a good part of the American public so understood that Lee was probably not guilty of the charges leveled against him.
Mm-hmm.
Though he was insolent to the commander in chief. You don't do that. So this was a political fight that allowed Washington to, or those around Washington, to claim a great victory. Read the letters in Congress. As all this began to develop, they thought the war was over, that the British were going to have to quit North America. Um, and Lee became the explanation. Well, if this was such a great victory, how was it that Clinton got clean away to New York City? Well, look, Charles Lee retreated and became the great excuse and Washington political credit for an enormous victory. And the army had done well, but Clinton indeed, following his orders, got away.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, Mark, are there any unsung heroes at the Battle of Monmouth? In other words, is there anyone that we should know about who performed extraordinary feats of valor or bravery in the battlefield?
There were so many individuals who could lay you could lay that honor upon. Alexander Hamilton was a brash kid. One incident that he insisted on remaining forward with Lee when Washington went back to organize the main line, and he probably one of the great brains of his day. But on that day, that brain was rattled. I mean, he was a kid. He was in combat. He ended up waving his swords with Lee, saying, "Stand here, General. I will die with you on this spot." Lee just turned to him and said, "Let me do my job, then I'll die with you here if you want. Now, calm down, kid." In other words, this is, but Hamilton, on his own, volunteered to stay forward and helped organize troops along that hedgerow so that Lee could make his stand. Horse shot out from under him. He was badly hurt. John Lawrence, his friend, the son of the president of the Continental Congress, had his horse shot out from under him and was badly roughed up as he also tried to organize troops during all of this. You had Joseph Silly, um, New England Continental officer who led Washington's first counterattack. Washington sent a battalion of picked men out. He sent two battalions of picked men, but Silly was the only one who was able to engage. And he took on the Black Watch, one of the storied regiments in British military history, and did it in just crackerjack fashion.
Mhm.
Classic movement to contact, stood the first fire from the Black Watch, and then had his picked men return fire. A fine combat officer. He really, really was.
Mm.
British side, early in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe, a great light troop commander, commanding the Queen's American Rangers. These were Americans. These were Tories, and he had turned them into a crack ready. Fought brilliantly in the morning, really opening the battle against American militia before any Continental troops had come up. Uh, you you had Henry Clinton, who, in the excitement of battle, uh, did something that no commander in chief ever should have done. He got out in front, waving his sword on his horse, screaming at his troops to forget, don't even form, just run for him, get these guys, rushing the hedgerow. One of his subordinate officers said, "This is our commander in chief. He's out there like a Newmarket jockey." And the British officers were split on this. They lauded his courage, but said, "My God, you're the commander in chief." You couldn't have had a greater comparison between what Clinton was doing in Washington, cool as a cucumber up there, just keeping his people under control, and Clinton going hell for
Yeah.
leather against him. He almost got shot. I mean, an American officer leveled his pistol at Clinton, and before he could pull the trigger, an aide to Clinton ran him through. I mean, that's how close it is.
Wow.
So you had
Amazing.
some really terrible fighting here. You had
Yeah.
Eleazar Oswald, American artillerist, who was with Lee in the morning, and he would keep shooting and keep firing until the British were only less than 50 yards away, and he'd finally limber up and pull back. They tried to get Oswald to testify against Lee at the court martial, and Oswald just said, "Are you kidding?" He gave me all the support I ever needed. He was so angry at at Lee's conviction that ultimately he retired from the army in disgust.
Hmm.
Guy's life is a movie script. After doing
Hmm.
all this, he quits the army. He becomes a political radical. When the French Revolution, and he wants to be made a colonel, by the way. He was a lieutenant colonel. He thinks he was passed over because of his, you know, standing up for Charles Lee didn't help his career.
Uh,
Passed over for colonel. The French Revolution breaks out. He goes over to France to fight for the French. They make him colonel of artillery. Then 1798, the year of the French. The French invade Ireland, send a task force into Ireland. Before they do that, they send an advance man in, somebody to lay the ground and everything. Who do they send? Eleazar Oswald. So he's there to greet the French expeditionary forces that lands in Ireland. And it was at Monmouth that Oswald was fighting his artillery against Cornwallis's advance. In Ireland, guess who's leading the British troops again? Charles
Cornwallis.
Cornwallis. He gets away after the French defeat. The Irish hide him. He gets on a boat. Can't go back to France. The channel is too well patrolled. He ends up in New York, just in time to die from the yellow fever.
Oh,
This guy's life is a movie.
yeah.
It
What a
really
story.
is. But
What a
and
story.
he comes right out of the Battle of Monmouth. All
Uh,
this stuff, and we could go on. There is just an extraordinary number of individuals who sort of found themselves in desperate situations
mhm.
and and rose to it.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Well, Mark, what's the one thing that readers should take away from your book? What's the one thing they should remember, if anything, about your book?
Battle is only part in a war. Monmouth is a classic example of how the military situation blends inextricably high stakes politics. Reputations ride or fall not just on what you do in combat, how the public perceives you. And Monmouth led to some of the highest stakes Army politics in American military. And it's all wrapped up in that one campaign. And I don't think there's another campaign in the history of the War for Independence where all of that comes together so tightly and in such a vivid picture. Uh, Gary Stone and I found it absolutely fascinating. And we found seemed to point in the direction of
Hmm.
new and something really exciting. People
Terrific.
don't take that away from the book. I
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. Well, Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. To our listeners and viewers, I've been talking with historian Mark Edward Lender, author of Fatal Sunday, George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle, available on Amazon and other book outlets. Let me hold it up for those people who can view it. Fatal Sunday. It's a terrific read. I strongly commend it to all readers. So join us again when the Real American Revolution brings you another in a series of interviews to help us better understand what really happened during our American Revolution and our war for independence. My name is Randy Flood. So long for now.